This is the Change Physician, episode 137. Welcome back to the Change Physician. I'm Melissa Cady, the Challenge Doctor, with my co-host, Dr. Kevin Cuccaro. And we're here to take a deep dive into our most recent episode with Tim Creasey, who is a Chief Innovation Officer. My little notes here. He does a lot of things. Presenter, a 20-year plus researcher, and a thought leader on managing the people side of change. And a lot of this is actually based upon the ADKAR method that was developed by Jeff Hyatt. And we discussed quite a few things regarding change. And so today we're just going to take a little bit more introspection on this. Of course, I will probably have him back for another episode. But what are your thoughts, Kevin, on this particular episode about the people side of change?
Too many thoughts. Too many thoughts.
Too many thoughts.
I'm going to kind of stick to what we discussed in the episode itself for now. So this is
what ADKAR stands for. You want to, since a little bit of repetition, we can tell them what it means, and I can say it if you want me to.
I could say it.
Okay, I didn't know if you had your list.
No, I was going to just say this. So it was Tim Creasey at ProSci, not ProSci.
Yes.
ProSci.com, where they're consultants, organizations, helping organizations to change. And the ADKAR model, which was quite interesting, is an acronym. It stands for awareness, desire, knowledge, ability, reinforcement. And we kind of discussed briefly that specific model. Kind of talked about it on an organizational standpoint, like how do you, if you're going in to change a system, how is that implemented and where those steps fit. But what I really thought was interesting is, like everything, there's the macro and then there's the micro. Mm-hmm. And so you can kind of look at this as an individual change. So it's very relevant to our listeners, because if you are in a big healthcare organization and you're trying to get your health organization to change, you're going to want to know this if you're going to implement this or pull into meetings, or simply actually if you're aware of the model, then you can determine whether or not you should even attempt to change, which we didn't talk about in that last episode. Right. But from an individual, if you have a desire to change, it's going to be very similar for you as well. Like as we've talked about for a year and a half now, awareness is the key. Awareness that there's a change necessary. If you are unaware, you cannot intentionally change. Do you have a desire to change? So even though we may recognize that there is an issue, that there is a problem, you may not have any desire at this point to change. And if that's the case, then you stop, right? You're aware of it, you recognize it's there, but you just are not choosing to pursue change because you don't have any desire. Perhaps you don't have the energy at this moment in time. Yeah. After you know that you have that desire, it's only after that really you start moving into this knowledge phase of what is it that I actually need to know in order to implement that successful change. And then once we have that kind of steps, where maybe in this wealth of internet age, we can find that knowledge fairly easily, is, well, then how do we develop the ability to do it? How do we realize that change? What are the skills that we need to have? What are the support networks that we need to create? Maybe we have to hack our environment in such a ways to then implement that change. And then finally, and we touched on this really briefly at the end of that episode, was what is oftentimes forgotten, is the reinforcement. Because how many times do we go into a state of change, even individually? You're starting a program, but we don't reinforce those behaviors so that they actually become sustainable, that they become almost part of your identity. And you can see that again on the micro level with an individual, but then just taking those same things. And then if you're looking at an organization, so much of what we see in healthcare, I mean, we should talk about in this episode, but there's so many places where change in healthcare systems neglect this. Not only is needed, yeah, but they miss all this stuff. And what the biggest one is even, as I said in that episode, was the reinforcement. Mm-hmm. They change, if you're changing your goalposts all the time, you're never going to get to where you need to go, and certainly you're not going to have that sustainable change to really embody that change anymore. Yeah. So it's important for the individual, but for the organization, absolutely just as much.
Yeah, and it amazes me when I think about all these parts and how people, not just organizations and the medical system and one individual, but or maybe an individual with an addiction. There's like all these if you don't have an awareness of a problem, like it's hard to even like make a change. But even in relationships, like in a marriage, there's certain things, there might be an issue. And if you don't, understand on the front end, why it's important to change, or if you have no desire to change, I mean, all these things. And if there is something needs to change, that the partner might need to reinforce. So I think, like you said, from a microscopic or a micro level versus a macro level, there's still, I think, a lot of value and looking at the process this way. And it's interesting because when you look at that, so it's awareness, desire, knowledge, ability, reinforcement, there's such a psychological component. And that's why they talk about, you got to deal with the people side of things, because from the knowledge that many of us could get on the internet in 2 seconds, or, or in-depth research, if you don't believe in your capacity or ability to implement that kind of change, then you're stuck in the water still. So there's just, it's an interesting human dilemma of how we can roadblock ourselves in so many places, and taking the time to be, and I could be guilty of this, is like not taking the time to be intentionally understanding at what part of the process is the breakdown. That's, I think, just getting it all into those pieces. And the questions, that's the part about the episodes, you have to go watch the episode, is the kind of questions you can ask yourself to help you decipher which part of the change process is where the problem is.
Well, and that's one of the reasons we have to have them back.
Mm-hmm.
It's because each of those, there's an overview of this change process, and they even mention that this isn't the only one. There's many different types of change. What I liked about ADKAR is they have 20 plus years of history behind them, that they're actually doing some retrospective kind of analysis with it. There is like all this stuff, there's rooted in evidence, because he touched on kind of the know-how, able to stuff, and that's part of the psychological literature on different places where people get struck. Like if you don't know how to change, you're probably not going to be able to change.
Right.
If you don't want to change, you're less likely to implement change. Right. And if you're not able to change, you're certainly not going to do it as well. And they didn't invent that, but they've made it into a very sequential methodology where you can start hitting those points, and you can start saying, well, hey, did we cover step one? And one of the, I just did some brief reading on this as well, is what they have done from a change standpoint for an organizational kind of focus is they focus very much on making sure each one of those steps gets done. They don't skip them. In fact, I think they say you can't skip any of those steps. And when you're in a large organization, sometimes, well, we can just jump to the knowledge. We obviously want to change, and we just need the knowledge. So just come in and tell us how to do it. Mm-hmm. But realistically, if you're working with any more than one person, and you say, oh, we know all that, let's just skip to the end here, you are probably wrong. And the more people that are involved outside of that one person, I would almost want to say it's probably exponential levels of wrongness. Like if it's 2, you're probably, maybe it's not exponential, whatever the doubling thing is, when it's 2 to 4, because with 2 people, trying to get 2 people on the same page to implement that change, you really need to make sure that you're making sure that you're both aware that you have the desire, that you have the knowledge, you have the ability, and that you're reinforcing each other. And that's just keeps scaling. An organization of 100 people, that's hard work. That's hard change. Yeah.
You're you can't really understand everyone else's process of that change. You're making assumptions by not engaging every individual. And you need to have the individual apply these things. Otherwise, the organization's not going to succeed. So I think from a very basic and an expanded exponential level, I think that this conversation with Tim was, it was very enlightening, that just to break down that process. And like you said, there's a lot of other processes, but I think there's a lot of elements that are similar. They're just maybe phrase a little bit differently, which you probably have researched more of that than I have, but.
It's humans, right? There's only, humans are interesting, and we have however many 4,000 years of thought behind it. So it's being able to take these kind of core principles that as we evolve, hopefully, and as we have more and more research to sort of support and figure out best ways, is then how do you implement it? And what these models do is they allow you to put that structured framework to take all this information and apply them. And this is a beautiful model.
Yeah.
And certainly I was unaware of it before we did this interview. Tim was a guest that you pulled in. I'm really glad you brought him in, because there's so much more to explore. And as a podcast calls The Change Physician, this is something I think that we need to touch on, is how do you make intentional change? Because Tim opened with that line about change, that change is everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Change is absolutely ubiquitous. And the question is not whether or not you are going to change. The question, realistically, if you're a human, is how are you going to change? Are you either going to do it intentionally, or are you going to do it unintentionally?
Reactively.
Unintentionally is reactive. You're like the ship in the storm without rudders or sailors on it, and you're flipping back and forth all over the place, and you end up who knows where you are, and maybe you're lucky and you crash land on a tropical island with lots of fruit and everything's perfect, or you're like Tom Hanks and you end up on the barren island with nothing but a volleyball. Really what we are about with the Change Physician podcast is intentional change.
Right.
Really focusing on being aware of this stuff, and then giving you knowledge, tool sets, mindsets, examples, et cetera, so that you can then be very, very intentional with what you do. And I don't know. I liked it. I like the episode. I think there's some really good initial steps. But like anything, like any really good sort of episode, if you only have whatever we had, 30 minutes, 40 minutes, there's just so much more to unpack in there. I mean, each step, of ADKAR, every one of those steps, there's, once you hone on one, then you can open it up. It's like a book, right? So it's like pulling the book off on the awareness piece, and then you open it up, and there's all these little points of intervention in there. So anyway.
Yeah. No, I think we only touched on the outline of ADKAR, and there's many chapters to unpack down the road. And I know that Tim's agreed to come back on board. So
we better now, since we keep talking about him.
I know. Maybe it'll be a great start to 2022. So yeah. Why don't you take us out? Unless you have anything else to say, I think this is an awesome episode.
Yeah. So thank you all for joining us today on the Change Physician podcast, where we unpacked our interview with Mr. Tim Creasey of ProSci and the ADKAR method. Yeah, if you have any tips or any thoughts about change, please reach out to us directly at thechangephysician.com. If you like the episode, obviously rank us on whatever your platform is. If you have something you disagree with, contact us and let us know, and we will address it in a future episode. And until next time, stay well.
Take care.